Okay, everyone. I think I'm going to kick things off and welcome you all here. My name is Mark Ledbury. I'm the director of the Power Institute and the chair of the Art History Department at the University of Sydney, as many of you will know. And I'd first like to acknowledge that the campuses of the University of Sydney are founded on the ancestral lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I wish to pay my respects to their elders past and present and welcome any members of that community here. I would also like to say a big thank you to everyone for coming, but it'll be my job this morning is to welcome you to sort of say a very brief word about the fact that this event is really the initiative of two of the, well, I hope they won't mind me calling them young and energetic scholars of Asian art, and Olivier Cricher and Stephen Whiteman. Stephen Whiteman is a relatively newly arrived colleague, though he's done so much that it feels like he's been here for a long time. But Stephen and Olivier have curated a wonderful program, and this event prepares a special issue of the Journal of the Art and Australia and New Zealand Journal of Art, which is, as you know, the sort of peak body journal for art historians in Australia and New Zealand. But in a way, from being a kind of, if you like, a written project, they have really created something much more live. And of course, it's always great to have so many distinguished speakers from all over Australia and New Zealand here. And so I'd like to welcome all the panelists and speakers. It's fantastic that you could all make it. And I'm sure that the eventual special issue will be even more special because of the engagement that you're having over the next day and a bit. I also want to say a very big thank you to the team that's made it all possible, to Vicky Mallett, to Marnie Williams, to Mimi Kelly, and to everyone at Power and throughout the faculty and school who've helped to sort of logistically make things possible. That's all I want to say, except that, as you know, if anyone comes to Power events, there's never occasion slips for me to spruik something else that's happening. And I also want to say that should all this whet your appetite for other Power events, I want to flag an event in a couple of weeks, which is another of the initiatives that Stephen Whiteman has been very centrally involved in, and that is on the digital and art history and on digital humanities, its impact on the discipline of art history more generally. And we are curating a rather ambitious two-site symposium which goes from ANU in Canberra and travels by train. But talk about the digital future of leaving the one train that leaves Canberra a day and comes to Sydney. But that is the only old-fashioned thing about this seminar, which otherwise is bringing together experts in the digital humanities, especially those with an interest in the visual, across Australia, and they are coming to Sydney. And on the Thursday, the 5th of November, there's a fully public day of discussions where people will be presenting projects, thinking about the future. The whole event is called Recasting the Question, and it asks, well, what kind of art history will we be doing enabled by all these digital tools? What actually will be the questions that we go looking for the answers to, enabled by all this new technology? And, casting both an enthusiastic and a sceptical eye on what kinds of changes might come about or might not. And the whole day is public, and it's all happening in the Charles Perkins Centre seminar room, which is part of the brand new and rather impressive Charles Perkins Centre building down the road, well, right down the road here past the Ovals. But then, as a sort of rounding off and high point, there's the keynote speech by one of the pioneers of digital art history, Caroline Brazelius, a historian of the Renaissance who's done so much extraordinary work at Duke with a group. And she's coming to give a talk which is called Digital Thinking and Art History, and that's at 6 o'clock. And that will be in the, I think I'm right in saying, the auditorium of the Charles Perkins Centre, which is downstairs. Right, so that's my advertising breakdown, and I'm going to hand over because I know that both Olivier and Stephen have things to say to introduce, but I just want to say again, it's great to see you all here. I hope you have a fantastic day of discussions and debate, and thank you all. Thanks. Steve, is it Stephen or Olivier? Olivier.
I'm going to precariously read from my screen, but I've also got some thanks and acknowledgements. My name is Olivier Krischer. For those of you who haven't met me before, it's a real pleasure to be involved in this, and it brings together ideas that certainly I'd had for a while, and happily I've been able to work with Stephen and Power on this. So the first thanks definitely go to my co-organiser, Stephen Whiteman, who, as any of the presenters will know, has really kept communications very smooth and tight, and has, as Mark mentioned, despite being a relatively new colleague, has been so positive and energetic about getting this together, which is just fantastic. And if anything, as I assured him, we can use that new status to the full to ask questions that we think everyone knows, and the sorts of questions that we take for granted. And I think that's something that really drives what we're doing today. There's been a lot of, obviously, intergenerational change in the field, both here and overseas. And one of the things that we talked about getting this day together was how much of that experience and so on is really being passed on, even for the stories that we think we all know. So I'd like to thank Stephen to begin with, and the Power Institute for organising and support, obviously AANZ as well. And thanks to all who also submitted abstracts, so not only the presenters who have been selected to present today, mostly because of the themes and so on that they were dealing with, but we also had a lot of other abstracts submitted that pushed our thinking for what the day could be. And I hope that some of those submissions are also here today, some of the people who submitted. I'd like to thank also, to begin with, two respondents who, at rather short notice in some ways, were able to make it. James Bennett, the curator of Asian art from the Gallery of South Australia, and also Susie Lingham, who was talking last night as well, but she's been able to be here to be a respondent for our session tomorrow, which is a closed session in which we're really trying to use the idea of a workshop with the presenters to push the publication further. So rather than a typical sort of conference idea, we're really trying to work together towards something beyond just the papers that people are presenting today. And I should mention that Susie's the director of the Singapore Art Museum. Last but not least, I'd like to thank the audience, all of you who registered, and we've been very happily surprised at the very strong interest that the event has had, and I think that was rather vindicating. Obviously, there's a lot more that can be done, and that's really the next thing I was going to say. There's many people who are more experienced, certainly, than us as co-organisers, and that's been one of the things that we wanted to draw on, the experience that's in this room, which is incredibly rich, and between all of us there's many, many decades of experience, both in curatorial work, in teaching, obviously, art history, art practice, collection, and so on. This symposium, however, does not set out to tell the whole story of Asian art history in Australia, and if you look at the lineup of papers, I think it's reasonably clear that there are gaps, and so clear, in fact, that I'm going to point out a few of them. We've actually opted, instead of trying to do a huge overview with one paper on every particular subject that we could think of, we really chose papers that seemed to coalesce around certain ideas and presented more diverse approaches to particular themes. And so you'll see from the lineup that really we're dealing today with institutional histories and exhibition histories, seminal institutions, so art galleries at state, national level, and also seminal exhibitions dating from the 19th century through to the present. So there's some sense of a chronological sort of overview and so on, but we're really we're aware that we're looking at institutional histories. And on the other hand, there's no papers, for example, dealing with a single artist or artist groups or artist organisations in particular. There are no papers addressing, for example, Asian art history education, which is something which, again, there's so much experience in the room, and yet, for whatever reason, we didn't really find papers dealing with that, and so we decided not to try and force it in that direction. The other major and significant gap, which hopefully is rectified in the future, is the Asian Australian and Asian New Zealand experience, both for the contributions of diaspora artists as well as subsequent generations to these art worlds. And that's something, again, which is lacking from today's lineup. So certainly there are other gaps as well. And that's all to say that this is a work in progress, that there's a lot more that can be done. To get things started, I think one of the interesting things from the lineup of papers today is how many of these histories hinge on particular characters and on sometimes rather lucky opportunities, other times missed opportunities, and you'll see there's many stories of those. So as a way to get going, I thought I would, if I bring up some slides, I would talk a little bit about some sort of unintended connections to what we were doing here today in a recent project. So when we talked about getting the program together, we obviously had to choose an image for the program, and that sort of forced us to think, well, what are we really doing, and what do the papers, what are they trying to say? And we were hesitant to choose one image in a way. If you're trying to aim for diversity and different approaches and voices, one's reluctant to try and choose one image which is inevitably going to be read as somehow symbolic of what we're doing. And in the end we came to this image by Ian Fairweather, who I'm sure needs no introduction for many people here. And I just wanted to say, I guess, that this is an image titled Hangzhou, dated 1941, despite having lived in Hangzhou, so I was personally quite partial to the image, but also conscious of the fact that it seemed to relate to something quite ancient, and as his artwork tends to do, and yet point to something also completely modern and contemporary, and sort of looking at the past and looking at the future. But the one thing that then resonated, which I didn't actually know at the time, was that his work was also on the cover of Art in Australia in 1963, which at the time also claimed to be focusing on the art of our immediate neighbours, which I thought is an interesting thing to point to. Elsewhere, I also came across in some work that I've been doing for an exhibition on the history between China and the Australian National University, and particularly the diplomatic relations between China and Australia in the 1940s. I've been looking at some archival material, and some of that, this is one image from there, and the gentleman you see here, Sadler, is presenting a Japanese print to Thea Proctor, and it's a caricature of this. Whether it really happened or not, I suspect it probably did. But what's interesting, I thought to mention here, is that Sadler was teaching Japanese at the University of Sydney. He was one of the earliest teachers of Japanese, and he really knew his stuff. So it's not a caricature of somebody who's just passing on Japanism. It sort of conjures all these images of somebody who'd actually written histories of Japanese history, with obviously Thea Proctor, a seminal modern Australian artist. And so again, it pointed to me. I thought, oh, maybe this image could be an interesting one for the program. But we decided otherwise. And that, incidentally, is the cover of that magazine, the Home magazine, which some of you may know. You might see the sort of Japanist fan that she's holding. Many of you will immediately recognise the artist behind this, but to give a longer introduction, and this is really where I'll end my comments. This is another anecdote from the project that I talked about dealing with China and Australia, and it's really one which for me highlights a lot of what the papers deal with today, and that's, again, missed opportunities on the one hand, as well as issues of art and diplomacy, and the uncovered histories even in the institutions and the archives that we think we know very well. So I was working, as I said, on this project dealing with the 1940s in China and Australia. And in that context, there's a gentleman by the name of Frederick Eggleston, who was Australia's first minister to China in 1941. China, this was obviously Republic of China under the nationalist government, and it was wartime China, so he went to Chongqing. And looking at his archival papers, I was rather surprised to see in his diary there's a few pages called Notes on Chinese Art, dated February 1944. The first surprise was that Eggleston, who was originally a barrister from Melbourne, but had been a public figure, he'd actually attended the 1919 Versailles Conference and various things like that. But the first surprise for me as an art historian was to read this minister's very confident and evidently quite experienced ideas on both traditional and modern Chinese art. He describes paintings he has seen. He describes painters he has seen paint. He contrasts, for example, in a positive way, the Chinese ink painting attempts to convey mood rather than surface realism, which he then goes on to compare with the likes of Turner, Cézanne and Whistler, which of course are by now classic comparisons, but bear in mind this is 1944. And then he mentions having seen sketches of Buddhist grotto paintings from his friend, Joseph Needham, who some of you in Chinese studies would recognize the name, but they were friends in China. But he's also seen sketches by Oral Stein, and he notes the possibility of a classical Greek influence borrowed from what he calls the Alexandrian empires long after they had passed, Alexandrian empires that we might think of as Gandhara and so on today. So all of this, of course, was piquing my interest in the place where I at least expected to find it. And then he mentions a Chinese painter he has met and watched, who many of you will have heard of, who painted this, Xu Beihong. He describes watching Xu, saying, "A picture by Xu Beihong of a horse will be dashed off in an hour." We saw quite a large picture with several figures and a lot of horses, and he told us that it was the 7th draft. He continues, "How such a method would commend itself to our artists, I do not know. My own opinion is that the vitality they strive for is obtained. I expect Xu Beihong's horse will be very much criticised in Australia as not being like a horse in departing from an anatomical accuracy, but I do not know any animal painting by any Western artist which is such a good study of an animal in motion. I will admit that the artist has sacrificed accuracy and detail in order to get the sense of motion. For instance, the head is a bit out of drawing." He uses this phrase, out of drawing. But this gives the impression that the head has just been tossed or is being tossed. As some, certainly Natalie here from the Art Gallery in South Wales will know, the image that you see here is actually from the Art Gallery in South Wales collection, and it's tantalisingly close to exactly what he describes, but the provenance suggests that it's not from the Eggleston family. But as you just heard, Xu Beihong could dash these off, and there's actually dozens of this type of horse around the world in various collections. Funnily enough, in an earlier letter, this is in March 1943, he was writing to the chairman of the trustees of what was then the National Gallery Museum, which is now the National Gallery of Victoria, a man by the name of Keith Murdoch, who some of you would probably recognise. And he writes this letter on the possibilities of exchanges of Chinese and Australian paintings. He says he was, and this is rather an interesting point, I think, he says he was once persuaded to organise an art competition, which he found to be a mistake because all the best artists submitted work and then didn't like competing against each other. So to resolve the problem, he writes, it ended up with me giving a present of some artists' materials to Xu Beihong, the professor of art at the Central University, and asking him to dispose of them as he saw fit. These materials are almost unprocurable. Unprocurable being in wartime China. By that stage, the Burma Road had closed, and so the materials, in a later newspaper article, it turns out the materials had been organised to be flown in from India for the purpose. So this is just, again, an anecdote. What does it say about the history of Asian art in Australia? Perhaps nothing much, but there's so many what-ifs. And again, I'd like to stress the way that this popped up for me in the most unlikely of places, and yet suggested this connection between Australia's First Minister in China, a man who's not known to art history particularly, and one of China's most eminent modern artists, who certainly, you could say, was one of the most influential in an institutional sense. And they obviously had some sort of relationship and understanding. And so, again, it just suggests all these what-ifs, which are yet to be discovered, as well as the issues of art and diplomacy, cultural exchange, and art as a platform for that, as well as missed opportunities and the undeniable importance of the certain individual figures that we need to still do biographical work on. Just lastly, because it's such a nice image, I couldn't resist. It's a bit dark, sorry. But this is the first cultural delegation in 1956 to China, which also was part of the research for this exhibition I mentioned. And what's interesting is on the far left, you'll see, well, the interpreter, and next to him, Joanne Lai. And then C.P. Fitzgerald, the first professor of Chinese studies at the ANU, that some of you will be familiar with. And over here, far on the left, is William Dobell. Sitting here, Elaine Haxton. And there's a number of other sculptors, writers, and there's also a curator. And funnily enough, this is the now declassified ASIO file that lists the people who were known to have accepted the invitation to be on this cultural tour. And again, totally different context in the 1950s and Cold War Australia. It again implies the sorts of histories that we maybe are yet to uncover. So I'll leave my comments there. I don't hope that they sort of frame in any conceptual way too much of what we're going to hear today, but just to suggest what's yet to be done. Thanks.